Well, hey everybody, what's going on? Today we're going to do a little bit of an anatomy lesson on an AR-15 lower. This happens to be a stripped lower, and what you see here is a bunch of the components. We also have a magazine, we have a vise block here and a little vise, and this would give you kind of a third hand. What we'll do in today's video, and I should say that there will be a more detailed video that will be on BitChute at my BitChute channel, and I will put a link to that down in the description. The BitChute channel is Every Blade of Grass 76, so if you go over there you'll be able to see a lot of this stuff in more detail. What we will do on the video today, so that it doesn't get censored or taken down by YouTube, is we'll sort of just name the parts and kind of tell what they are, maybe where they go, but we won't really show any type of build or anything like that. So what let's do is let's go ahead and let's get started. So we have the stripped lower here, and what a stripped lower means is that none of these components are in here, and you have a left side and a right side of the receiver. You have the rear and the front, and the way that you determine that is generally, let's say if this was the barrel and this was pointed down range toward the target, your right is the right side of the receiver and your left is the left side of the receiver. They are not mirrored sides of each other. They have different configurations, I guess, maybe for lack of a better word, where different components will go. And so how it is configured and designed is different from one side to the other. They are not mirror images. So what we'll do real quick is we'll start to name these components, and a lot of times if it's your first time build it can be rather confusing as, well, how do I know that this spring goes with this and not with that, and how do I know that this spring doesn't maybe go over here? How am I going to not get them mixed up? And depending on who you buy your lower parts kit from, if you're going this route, some of them may be kind of bagged up nice and neat and labeled with what they are. Sometimes they'll just come in a big jumble and you sort of have to figure it out yourself. So what we'll do is we'll just go ahead real quick and we'll go over what these components are named, and then what I may do is do a little bit of close-ups on these here a little bit later, and we may do some whiteboard stuff, and that way if we're maybe drawing some things out, maybe YouTube won't censor the video or take it down. So again, we have a stripped lower receiver, you have a pistol grip here, and then this is the screw that helps retain the pistol grip, and that fits on over here. So over here we have the hammer and the hammer spring, we have the trigger and the trigger spring, we have the disconnector and the disconnector spring. These two pins here are identical, and they're called the hammer and trigger pivot pins. Right here we have a magazine catch, the magazine catch spring, and then the magazine catch, whoops, I'm moving off here, the magazine catch button. You have your trigger guard and a roll pin. You have up here your buffer retainer and your buffer retainer spring. I'm kind of looking at the camera and sometimes I'm wandering off here. Here you have your selector switch or a safety, your selector switch spring, selector switch detent. Here you have your pivot pin and your takedown pin, and you'll notice that these are different sizes and they go on different places, and we'll maybe talk about that later. You have your now these are identical. The springs and the detents here are identical, and they're just called the pivot pin spring, the pivot pin detent, the takedown pin spring, and the takedown pin detent. Over here you have the bolt catch plunger, bolt catch roll pin, and the bolt catch spring. This is your receiver extension tube, and I don't have it here. We'll get to that here in a second. You also have a castle nut and an end plate. This is a magazine, and this is your pistol. I think I already talked about this. Is your pistol grip. What I don't have here is a spring and a buffer, and the spring and a buffer, this is a hollow tube, goes into here. So that is just some of the general stuff. Once you kind of get these things separated and you start to look at them, they kind of will only fit into one place, and they will sort of only fit into one place on the receiver. So they have specific places that they'll go. And once you kind of start to look at it and look at it from kind of the logic of how the receiver is put together, you understand, oh, okay, well, this has to go in here. Everything kind of fits. All right, so what let's do is let's go ahead and we'll move some of this stuff off, and we'll also go to the whiteboard, and I'll bring it and put it up here on the table, and we'll do some close-ups of this stuff, and we'll sort of draw out how they fit and where they would go. All right, so please forgive the crudeness of the drawing. What we have here is a drawing of what would be the magazine catch, the magazine catch button, and the magazine catch spring, and this on the receiver fits in and goes into that slot here. The button protrudes and comes out on the right side of the receiver over here. And the way that that works is the spring goes over here on the shaft. This is threaded on the end. The inside of the button here, and what I will do is I'll roll in a picture. Maybe I'll do a picture in pictures like somewhere over here so that you can actually see it. But the button is threads onto here, and it's held in with spring pressure. And then when a magazine is inserted in through here, on a magazine you have a little, if you can see it, you have a cutout here. And on the actual button itself, if you can see how it kind of hangs, there's a part where it kind of hangs down. When the magazine is pushed in, what happens is that button, or the little button in here, kind of falls in and clicks in, and that's what holds it. On your magazine, you'll also notice that there is a shelf right here, and what that also does is it stops the magazine from going up too far. Also on these particular magazines, you have it where it bottoms out on this. Not all magazines are done exactly the same, but that is how the magazine catch crudely works. So again, you would have this spring goes over that, is compressed, and then your button, which has, what these are the grooves in there that gives you a texture. So you have a textured side and a smooth side, and the textured side goes on there like that. Alright, so now the next assembly that we have is the bolt catch assembly. Sometimes this will be called a ping pong paddle, and that's what this guy is here. And we'll try and show you some of this stuff. So this would be the forward view here of looking at that. This is kind of the side view. If we were to look like that, the blue parts would be the back parts, and this little part here. So what this does, and then you have a bolt, you have a plunger, a spring, and then another little roll pin. And that all fits into this housing right here. You have on your receiver, you have some holes, and that's where the roll pin fits. And what it does is it, on this hole here, it allows it to pivot, and when the magazine comes in, the follower on an empty magazine will push this up, and that will hold, it'll catch the bolt. And then what you're going to notice as we go through this stuff is that a lot of it is done with little springs and spring pressure, which is it's a Fascinating design when you actually think about it. And again, this is the bolt catch assembly, and that goes into this part of the receiver here. And that would be on the left side of the receiver. Okay, so on the safety selector, most of them are going to be just a single-sided. This happens to be an ambidextrous one. So you'll have the safety lever will be on the left side as well as the right side. Generally, the safety selector is on the left side only a lot of times. And the way that it works is it is held in, again, with spring pressure. If you go back to the picture that I dropped in, or like I said, I may drop one in briefly, of the assembly, you have a detent, you have a spring, and then you actually have the lever here. What this represents is how it works. Basically, the spring sits under the detent, and the spring is housed in this hole here. And it's also housed in your pistol grip. The pistol grip will have a hole here. And the detent rides in sort of the shaft of the safety selector, and the inside of that basically has a hole here, and then there's a channel and then another hole. And so as you rotate the safety selector, what happens is that detent, which kind of looks like a little artillery shell, it goes from one side to the other. It goes out of this hole, rides down into the groove, and clicks into this hole here. And that's why this is shaped like that. And you're going to see a similarity of this shape again when we look at the takedown pins and the pivot pin. But that's why it clicks in, why you hear a little bit of a click, is you have that detent. When you rotate the lever, it goes from here and clicks over to here. So if we were to look on the actual safety lever, what we would see is, well, let me see if I've got something a little smaller. We'll use the back of the spring. So you see you've got a hole here, and then it will ride in that little groove and go here. So that's what that is. Okay, so now what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the pivot pin and the takedown pin, and they go into those holes here. I'll do it on this where you can see a little bit better. And you see that these holes on the receiver, they go all the way through, and the pins will actually enter in from the right side of the receiver. And they are held in again with spring tension, and much like we saw in the safety selector, the pins, if you were to take a close-up look at them, again, you're going to have, so if we hold it up here, we're going to have the pin, the hole, the groove, and then another hole. And again, it's that same thing. The way that the pin, or the pin is held in again with spring tension, which presses up against the pin as it goes in here, and that spring pushes that detent so that when you pull the pin in and out, it remains captured in the receiver and you won't lose it. If you didn't have something like that, you would have to have a different system, otherwise it would just fall right out. There is a difference in between the takedown pin and the pivot pin. And if you were to look at the tops of the pins, we would see that one is round and the other has a flat grooved in it, similar to this. And they're also different in lengths. And what we see is that the pivot pin is longer than the takedown pin. But again, it works on the same principle. You have the groove, which is here, and then you have your two holes where your detent, which is held in with spring pressure. On the pivot pin, and the reason they call it, you have a takedown and a pivot, and that's where they go. When you have the upper receiver on here, you will take this pin out first, and that's allows you to start taking down the rifle. This pin, you will allow it to pivot if you leave it in. If you pull this pin out, it allows the upper to come off of the lower receiver. And you'll notice that there is sort of a protrusion here, and if you look down in here, there's a hole, and your spring sits in here, and then you drop in the detent in here as well. And once you put that pin in, the spring wants to push up on that detent, and so it holds the pin, or it captures that pin and retains it in the firearm for you under spring pressure. Alright, so I guess this would probably be a more accurate drawing because you would have the two pins. You'd have your pivot pin, your takedown pin, your two detents, and your two springs. Also, one of the things that I forgot to mention, or just maybe it's an interesting note, your safety selector spring on there it's a little bit shorter, but it's a little bit maybe bigger, or it's wider, but it's not as long as these. So these are kind of long and skinny, and this is a little bit, if you compared the three springs, and that would be one way that you can tell them apart. Again, these two, there's only going to be one safety selector spring. There will be two of your takedown pin and your pivot pin and your takedown pin, and you'll have two identical detents and two identical springs. And there's no other two springs that will line up with these. And same thing with the safety selector spring. There's only one of those guys. Alright, so we'll go over a couple of different components here. We have the buffer retainer, which is sort of the shape of this, and that it's hollow on the inside. And again, this is just sort of the upside down version of this. And there's a spring that sits inside of here, so it would go up and rest in here. And on your back of your receiver, you have a receiver extension tube, or sometimes I'll just call it a buffer tube. And there's a spring that goes inside of here, and then kind of a weighted thing that sort of looks like kind of like a little bit of a torpedo. I'll just draw it here real quick. So you would have a spring that goes in here, and then you have sort of a kind of a weighted piece like that. So that your buffer, you got your buffer spring, it's housed in the receiver extension, or sometimes again called the buffer tube. This is threaded, this tube is threaded, which is this guy here, so you can see the threads here. And that threads into the rear of the receiver. And the way that the buffer and the buffer spring is, when you take the upper receiver off, there's spring pressure in here inside that tube, and in order to keep that from flying out, you have the retainer and the spring, and that sits down in that little hole here. And it's when you screw this tube into here, again, you're going to have your plunger and the spring, and then what happens is there's a little bit of a lip on there, and the edge of that tube comes up over the hole here. If you can, I don't know if you'll be able to see, hopefully you'll be able to see the hole. And then by that thing kind of going on there, the lip comes over when it is screwed in there, and that it rests up against here. So your edge of your tube, so the edge of the tube here, basically, whoops, that's the wrong end. That end didn't work too good. Anyway, it basically comes up here So again, this is your threaded part. So this is that part, and that rests up against there, and that's what keeps that inside the receiver. Alright, so we have our trigger guard here, and that goes here and here. You have two types of trigger guards. You're going to also have like a little roll pin that goes with it. But you'll have the original ones which were just straight across, and then you have one that would be called an enhanced trigger guard, which is similar to this, which is, you can see it kind of goes down, and what that does is it just makes more room if you had a gloved hand or something like that. So normally you would have your trigger guard would just go like this. You have two kind of wings or ears, and that's what this goes into. Your sort of the rear of the trigger guard, and it's held in with this roll pin here. On this one, you'll notice that you have a kind of a hole, that a little divot that doesn't go through, but then you have a hole here. And I'm not going to be able to draw it very well, but if you'll notice here, there's a little kind of a spring plunger that's held in, and when you place this into the lower receiver, that will click in. And once you have the roll pin in the back, let's say if you had a thick glove and you just couldn't get your finger in there, it was designed that you could push this pin, and that will allow that to rotate down, and it hangs in there. So it would rotate and kind of hang out of the way. And there's really only one way you can do the trigger. The trigger guard. You might say, well, it seems like it would go in this way or it would go in that way. So how do I know which way? If you were to put this all the way up, if you can tell here, it interferes into the magazine well, and you wouldn't be able to get a magazine in. So you can only put the trigger guard in one way. And quite honestly, you actually having to sort of let it kind of fall down out of the way probably would never ever happen in a million years. You would probably just go ahead and take your glove off before you would do that. Okay, so you have to forgive the crudeness of the drawings, but what we have here is the hammer, and the hammer fits into the lower receiver, and it will actually be held in through a pin here, which is this. And we talked about that, the hammer pivot pins. So you have a hammer pivot pin, and then you also have a trigger pivot pin, and they will be the same. So the pins have little grooves in them there and there, and that's kind of my crude drawing of how they look. Also, you have a spring, which is this guy here, and then if we're looking at the side of the hammer like this, you'll notice that there's looks like a little wire that's in there, and when the hammer is, and you'll have the trigger would be already placed in, but when the hammer is placed in here and is held in with this pin, this little wire down here, this is the hole here that it goes through. So this is this view of it that way. So when you take that pin and it goes through this hole, this spring here and here is wrapped around here, and this part here goes up under in here. And this little wire in here kind of slots in to this groove that's here, and it helps it to stay in place and helps it to keep from moving around. There's a specific way that you want the spring to go on, and we won't necessarily go on to that here, just because this isn't necessarily a build video. It's just, this is where, you know, certain parts go and what they are, that type of thing. So, but again, it's relatively simple. When we go over the trigger, you'll see how the spring is held in place and how you want it to be able to have tension and things like that. So, but like I said, that may be on the bit shoot video or in another video that we do where we go into more detail on how to actually assemble stuff. Alright, so let's move on to the trigger. Alright, so once again, please forgive the crudeness of the drawings. But you have your trigger, your disconnector, your disconnector spring, pivot pin, the trigger spring. So this would be our pivot pin. This is the side and top views of the trigger. This would be your disconnector, the spring, and then this would be the trigger spring. So that trigger spring is, and I can't really draw it very well, but that's that guy here. Let's see if we can move it where you can maybe see it a little bit better. The disconnector, there's a spring that is sort of like a pyramid shaped spring. So it's skinnier on one end and it gets wider at the bottom. If we were looking at the trigger like that, what we would see is that there's a hole, and that's where that spring fits in. So there's a hole down in here. When this is all put together, you have the disconnector. This hole on the disconnector, which is the hole right there, lines up with this, and it slots down into here, and that you've got, again, spring pressure, which is holding this up, and then your pin here is pushed through these, and once these line up, so you'll have that hole lines up with that hole, and that all lines up with that, and then once you have your spring on the trigger, that's what gives you your pressure to where the trigger wants to go back and forth, and it just doesn't flop. It just doesn't flop in there. So if you had that inside there, inside the receiver, and you didn't have any springs, even if you had the holes lined up, it would just, there wouldn't be anything. Your spring is what gives you that pressure. So I think that's kind of about it for sort of the anatomy lesson. Again, it isn't meant to be a build video. Oh, you know, I did want to show one other thing real quick. So if we go back to the hammer, once this pin is put into the receiver down in here, when you have your hammer spring certain manufacturers will make it to where you'll actually have 3 grooves, and then your hammer springs will fit into those grooves. Generally, it will just fit into the one on your trigger pivot pin. So I don't know if you can, even if that makes sense right now, since we're not actually doing any of the actual build stuff. All right, everybody, that's going to do it for the video today. Hopefully, I didn't confuse you more, but generally what you'll find is that it's a very clever design, and that you're not going to really be able to mix up your springs or put them in different places. A lot of times they're just not going to fit. They're either going to be too big or too small, too long or too short. If you want to see a detailed video on the actual build that I'm going to do on this particular receiver, I'm going to do that over at my BitChute channel, which is Every Blade of Grass 76. I'll put a link down in the description. I'll also do a link to, I'm on Full 30 as well, and I finally got over on there, and so I'm putting some videos up there, and I'll have that same video, the detailed video, that will go up over there as well. Also, this video that you're watching will be mirrored over there too. So, and over on Full 30, it's Every Blade of Grass is my channel over there. Other than that, I will say so long for now, and thanks for watching and hanging out with me. And hopefully this answers some questions that you have. If you do have any questions, go ahead and put them in the comments, and if I can help you out, I will. I am by no means an expert.